Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining this webinar on the topic of chatbots, virtual humans and consumers. Our speakers on this thought-provoking topic today are experts in the field of voice and facial recognition, virtual and augmented realities. And they are involved in helping to create digital humans, which can pick up cues and facial expressions to provide a more empathetic response. But before I introduce our speakers, I want to say a few words about IORMA, who have organized this webinar. The IORMA Consumer Commerce Centre is a neutral resource for businesses and governments that recognises their need to understand and respond to the ways in which the 7.8 billion global consumers are changing, and the products and services they want and need, and the ways they want to obtain them. These changes are happening globally, driven by developments in society, in business, and in technology. And IORMA are producing a series of thought leadership discussions, which are held every other Thursday. The topics are chosen from IORMA's horizon scanning, its surveys, and its research. But let's go to today's topic of chatbots, virtual humans and consumers. It is estimated that by 2025, artificial intelligence will deal with 95% of consumer transactions. 2025 doesn't seem that far away, and yet 82% of us are actually prefer to be dealt with by a human. But this could be changing. And before we start our discussion, let's have a look at a video of the current state of the art for real-time digital humans as created by Unreal.
I am a metahuman, the next generation of digital human powered by Unreal Engine. Metahumans are high-fidelity digital characters created by you, the user, on our new content creation platform, MetaHuman Creator. I am fully rigged, ready for animation and motion capture, allowing you to work in context. With everything running live in Unreal Engine, my motion works seamlessly
on other characters. I have 8 levels of detail and have been tested on a wide range of hardware platforms, from feature film to mobile. If you're interested in learning about my animation rig or high-fidelity deformations, built on Control Rig, the new strand-based hair system via the Groom component, or how everything is tied together and animated in Sequencer, then have a look under the hood in this project. This is just a glimpse of things to come.
So I hope that video puts this topic in context. And let's talk to our excellent panelists. Before I do that, let's introduce myself. So my name is Dr. Julie Wall, and I'm a reader in computer science and Director of Impact and Innovation at the University of East London. I work on research in deep learning, natural language processing, and natural language understanding. And I am very much interested in the topic of this webinar. So our first panelist is Ross Edwards, IORMA Immersive Technologies Director and iLab Director. Ross, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yes, Technology Director at IORMA, and also involved in some virtual reality projects over the last few years, and again, very interested in the state of art where digital humans are.
Thank you, Ross. Our next panelist is David Burden, founder and CEO of Daden Limited. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. I've been involved in chatbots since the mid-1990s. I spent most of the 2000s building virtual librarians, and then most of the 2010s working with MOD, looking at application of chatbot technology within their areas. We were a finalist in the British Computer Society's machine intelligence competition. And a couple of years ago, I wrote this book here on virtual humans.
Excellent. And last but not least, our final panelist is James Laird, COO, Intelligent Voice Limited. Jim, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. Jim Laird, I'm the COO at Intelligent Voice, and I sit as the product owner of our lexical suite, which is our behavioural analytics platform that leverages speech to text to perform some really smart stuff around inferencing across calls and any form of audio. And before this, a slightly divergent career. I was a detective in the Metropolitan Police for 15 years before moving across to industry. I say it's slightly divergent, but the more I learn, and particularly over the last 2 years, having worked with Julie and the team at UEL, I come to understand that, you know, policing is challenged by knowns, unknowns, and is always fighting bias, and that seems to be how we spend most of our time in the data world with the R&D we're up to at IB and across our exciting projects. So it's great to be here today. Thanks for inviting me.
Excellent, thank you. I guess we have to be careful what we say now. Okay, so let's kick off with our questions. Please note for the participants, you can write questions in a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen throughout the webinar, and we will go through all of your questions at the end. So first one, let's go to David. So we have these different terms, David. We have chatbots, virtual or digital humans. Can you give us your definition of what are these? What does the terminology mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of terms out there and significant overlap between them. I think, to me, digital humans has tended to be used by people within sort of the human factors and the medical sort of fraternity. So it's where you're talking about a representation of the human, and the focus is on sort of doing things to it. So can it sit in this vehicle? What happens if you give it this drug? So that the digital human is a very passive respondent to what it is that the physical humans want to do. And in fact, we're seeing a little bit of that in the idea of digital twins, where we're taking the same approach but applying it to whole cities or to mechanical devices. To me, virtual human is sort of the broadest category, and that's where you've got a computer program that's trying to present itself as human, but it's doing that for a particular purpose, and that could be sales, it could be marketing, it could be mentoring. I'm sure we'll touch on a lot of the other uses as we go through this presentation. And then within that, chatbots is one of the technologies that goes into making up a virtual human. It's certainly conceivable you could build a virtual human without the ability to chat. But almost the minute you have a chatbot, you almost by definition have an element of a virtual human. So yeah, to me, chatbots is sort of like a subset or a constituent part of a virtual human.
And maybe, well, for David or for anybody else, for Ross or Jim, do you think the layperson on the street understands the difference between these terms? Or what's the common terminology? Ross?
Yeah, I think it's like any new technology. There's a mix of use of the words and the phrases at the moment. I come from more sort of film background, so digital humans and stuff have a sort of different relation to that term, as in sort of how we put that into sort of feature films and as doubles and such like. So I think it's just a matter of time that there'll be a unification of terminology. It usually takes a couple of bit of standout bit of software or products to come out. Then the terminology will come a bit more straightforward, hopefully.
I think you'll have to excuse me if I pass to the dark side of this, but I think if we look at the representation around deepfake, for example, there was a lot of coverage about Tom Cruise this week, I think, and as a business, we're very focused on fraud detection, as you'll know yourself, Julie, with our projects. Mm-hmm. People are perhaps being presented with the worst side of this technology, although we're all very comfortable potentially with the best side. My kids see it within the gaming environments that they explore, etc. So it's becoming more mainstream. It's just how we represent it to the layperson, if you like, is going to be significant in terms of development and adoption.
Very true. And to follow up on that film side of things, is this technology similar to other AI related technologies where the expectation of what we actually have today is very different because it's so commonplace in film?
Yeah, I think most people's expectation is where they sort of conflate the ideas of artificial intelligence, virtual humans, digital humans, all into the same thing. And they very much tend to have a science fiction sort of sense of what these things are and what they're capable of, and are then somewhat surprised and annoyed when they discover the current technology not living up to that.
Maybe we should have a look at what are the technologies. So Ross, let's start with you. What are the technologies that go into these types of tools, such as chatbots and virtual humans? And do we create digital characters?
Regarding the digital human side of things, I think it sort of kind of breaks down into two sort of sections. One, if you're making you're trying to make a copy of someone like an actor or something, so you're gathering data from the actor and then placing that onto sort of a 3D model, or whether you're creating a digital human from scratch sort of thing, a generic realistic human. For gathering the information, say if you had an actor, you would use like a light stage, which is a room which is sort of, the actor will sit in the middle and be surrounded by lights and also cameras. And then the actor will go through a whole range of facial movements and things. So those will be recorded. And then they'll probably go into like a 3D modeling software where you've got a mesh, a model of a head. And those high resolution textures will then be embedded onto that mesh. So then they can use that. And another part of the process is something called rigging. So if you've got 3D models, then you need to have some sort of structural constraint on how it moves. So you almost have these bones inside it, so you've got to rig it. So, I mean, there's so many sort of facial muscles we have that on the Unreal rig, which was demonstrated in the video, there's so many muscles that's got to sort of react exactly the same way as humans have. And as humans, we've got such a sensitive, we're so sensitive to other people's faces and how they look, and it's such a slight change of muscle movement in someone's face we can read. So we're trying to embed that into the digital human, so it's very natural. It's the problem with this is very computationally heavy, and also getting realistic hair and such things. It's really pushing the computational side of things. But it's certainly getting there. It's you know, the Unreal demonstration earlier was showing how close it is getting, and also they're being able to transfer that to, so you can use it on mobiles and things, which is very important as well, being able to use it on different platforms. And a lot of thing that is driving this is from the game engines, and that's Unreal is obviously Epic are behind the game Fortnite and stuff. So a lot of the new technologies have been pushed by game engines advancement, which has just really sort of increased so much in the last few years.
It all sounds quite complex, actually, doesn't it? Is there, and you mentioned about how we want to, you know, use this type of technology on mobile phones, which is where all AI kind of seems to end up. How far away are we from that? Is that possible?
That's all about scalability and the way you optimize for each level. Same as VR. VR, you can't get the same resolution as you can on monitors, or so it's all about being able to adapt to optimize things as much as you can. Yeah, that's the thing, is, as I think David alluded to earlier, it's not just a one-click button. It's not just like we've suddenly got, you know, so we can suddenly have digital humans in there, you know, at an instant. Even though the deep fake stuff, some of the big deep fake stuff, I mean, I saw the Tom Cruise thing. It is, yeah, it's very quite impressive in a way. That some of that can be done quite easily, but other bits, when you're looking at how the light's reacting off the humans and models, and how the skin is, and then you're dealing with things like subsurface scattering and things. And so you're working out how the light reacts when it goes into the pores, and just so there's so many sort of subtleties to doing digital humans, especially the facial areas and how it moves and how it reacts. It's not just a click of a button away at the moment.
I think, well, one thing that's quite important is to try and keep a divide between the technologies which are used to actually present or to represent the virtual human, and those that are actually driving what it's doing. So for instance, you know, any of that sort of very high resolution head and shoulders could be driven by the world's dumbest virtual human or by the world's smartest virtual human. And certainly when you're looking at investing in this technology, what you want to do is make sure you've got a fairly clear separation between how the virtual human is going to present and what's actually driving it. So that if you want to deploy it onto a mobile, well, you just deploy it as a text chat device. But if somebody's actually got a high resolution screen and a powerful computer, then they can have a full sort of head and shoulders avatar. So I think there should always be a quite clear separation between those technologies, which, if you like, are building the brain of the virtual human, and those technologies which are dealing with the representation.
Okay. And why are we using these technologies? What are they used for? Jim, maybe we'll go over to you.
Sure. I mean, Well, we see it having value, of course, and as a business, we're focused on contact center use cases. But I mean, consistency first and foremost. If you can apply, brand ethics or whatever it might be to the same problem each time, that's easier from an analysis perspective to understand where failings in process might be. But the really interesting stuff for us from a behavioural perspective is relevance, and how you can over time understand how a certain interpretation by the customer of an individual, so this digital human, how you represent your business on a person by person basis can have significant impact on rapport building. That drives the bottom line in terms of sales engagement and or customer retention. So, it's about fit and feel as much as it is consistency and analytics.
And when we think about, humans, as opposed to these types of virtual humans, what's the benefit of one over the other? So
you mean of virtual humans as against physical humans? Yeah, well,
yes.
I mean, the most obvious argument is the sort of 24/7 and scalability argument that once you have a virtual human, you can have as many of them working as many times, as hard as you want. The more interesting one for us is there's a concept called anonymous intimacy, which sort of researchers have been aware of for probably a couple of decades now, which is actually when people talk to a chatbot or a virtual human, it feels a very intimate sort of one-on-one conversation, but at the same time, it feels very anonymous. You're just talking to a computer. And so the evidence shows actually people tend to disclose more information in that situation than if they're, say, filling out a web form, which doesn't feel intimate, although it might feel anonymous, or talking to a human face-to-face, where it feels very intimate, but it's definitely not anonymous, and you might feel you're actually being judged by the person that you're talking to. So some interesting ways in which you can use this technology in a variety of different roles. But of course, that immediately starts to open up a whole bunch of different ethical questions, and particularly about making people aware that they are talking to a chatbot in situations where they might get confused.
David, I wonder if I might ask you a question on that. I mean, I wonder, we're getting more and more inquiries around telemedicine. Obviously, it took off as a consequence of the pandemic. And just picking up on your point there in terms of disclosure. Disclosure is something, we as a business seek to understand. I mean, that's at the cusp of our core understanding of credibility, if you like. Are we getting full disclosure from the individual? Do you see a benefit then, perhaps? I mean, I imagine we've all had that uncomfortable trip to the doctors where we've had to disclose something which we're not comfortable doing. Do you think perhaps people might be more comfortable disclosing those things to a virtual human, and thus we get to the detail quicker? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, certainly some of the work we've done, we deployed what we call a virtual life coach to support some employees, and that dealt with a lot of the issues that they might otherwise feel very sensitive about discussing, both sort of medical health, sexual health, financial health issues, and the feedback we got from them was actually like this idea that they could actually sort of gather information, and it's often about just verbalizing what you want to say, so as to help you think through it, rather than just necessarily getting sort of expert input, but just the ability to do that to better understand what the issue might be and then how to address it, and then to decide when to go and talk to the human. They saw as a significant benefit. The counter to that is when you then talk to the experts, they say, well, actually, I'd like them to come earlier when they're not quite so concerned, because I stand a chance of catching things, sort of nipping things in the bud. So there's a definite trade-off there. But I think the idea of actually on a health app of giving you the option of, do you want to talk to a physical human, or would you like to talk to a virtual human about this, would be an interesting thing to do, and then see what sort of decisions people make.
And would you flip it? I mean, some of the work our guys have been around sort of Zoom fatigue and trying to take the human out the loop of conferencing with an AR/VR representation of me, so I don't have to smile and nod along all the way through a conference because they're back to back all day. But taking it back to that medical use case, would you see there being benefit then in me being able to represent myself as a digital human to my doctor in these interactions?
I mean, completely. I mean, we had our team meeting this morning at 9:30. We were all avatars inside a virtual world, because actually that's quite a nice way of doing it. And as you say, it actually becomes fun, because we're not staring at this wall of Zoom faces. We're all different avatars running around the place, talking to each other, doing work, but very much socializing at the same time. And again, the experience has shown that having that avatar representing yourself gives you a certain distance in the conversation and makes you willing to potentially say things, consider things, look at things in a different way. So yes, having that ability to walk into the doctors as an avatar. And then of course for the doctor to then try and work out, what your avatar looks like, how that compares to the real self. Starts sometimes to say a lot about things like body image as well.
Yeah, really interesting.
If we think about how virtual humans are becoming so realistic and how people feel comfortable speaking to virtual humans, do you think there could ever be an issue that customers could reveal personal details that they wouldn't normally do? And what are the ethical implications of that? Ross, maybe we could get your input on this.
Yeah, I think it goes back to almost what David was saying, is about whether you're talking to a human or a digital human. I think it's a, I mean, it is a very interesting question. I think, I mean, if you had a case, if you were phoning up a bike shop about a bicycle, a technical question about a bike, would you be concerned if you were talking to a digital human or a real human? If the feedback you was getting was accurate and the information you was getting coming back to you was helping you, would you really mind whether it was a digital human or a real human? I mean, obviously there's different cases, sort of different scenarios, as we're saying, with medical uses, and maybe if you're on the dating side, it might not be great if you're talking to a digital human, but I think the ethical thing is about having it, if you know what you're talking to. So maybe there is something that comes up in the corner of a screen or something if you're talking to a digital human, just so you realize that there is a difference or whatever. But it's, I think it's a fascinating question to follow up on.
Is there ever any issues with people speaking to virtual humans in a way where, they don't speak politely or they're aggressive or rude because they're not speaking to another human? Is that the converse side where they're so comfortable that they're not behaving properly?
Yeah, I think that could be. It'd be interesting to see any sort of research or feedback from all this. And also, as David and James are talking about, is that there's a comfort, I think, in sort of the digital avatars and things. We found this in VR, is that people are willing to speak openly about different subjects, about very sensitive subjects, and especially in VR, I think, because you got some sort of body movement, you can read some other signs that your body can't really read in when it's flat on the screen. So it gives people freedom. And then in educational ones, I know that children have been a lot freer and being able to speak back to avatars because they feel like they're not being judged. So it takes away the judgment side of things as well.
Julie, I think we should expect to see that if we haven't already seen it. I mean, the work we're doing at the moment around toxic behavior in online gaming communities, I mean, it's a huge problem. And we know from one particular vendor, 50% of their games result in a complaint for toxic behavior because people feel comfortable to behave in a way that is not socially acceptable in the real world, whether that's, racism, nationalism, sexism, extremism, or just good old-fashioned bullying and abuse. It's a huge problem that industry is having to work very hard, and with legislation from January this year that compels them to do so, to resolve. If it happens there, it's going to happen in the digital world.
I think, sorry. Yeah, I think there's a case with Microsoft. They came out with a like a chat box. Hey, yeah. I remember. Which they released, and I think after one day it had to be taken down because it became racist on Twitter. Social media and a whole range of things. So again, it opens up a really massive can of worms. Not necessarily just technological, but also sort of yes, how people communicate anyway, I believe.
So whether somebody is speaking to a virtual human or somebody is speaking to, say, a digital human, or somebody speaking to an avatar with a human behind it, the behavioral element is kind of the same, just what you're saying. Jim, or go on, David.
Well, I can't say for sure, and I let David and Ross guide me on this, but certainly I know in terms of, if we call your gaming persona your avatar, right, we know that it's a huge problem. I'm saying if it happens there, then I'd expect to see it happen, particularly in the contact center space. There will always be an element who will seek to either push past that technology because they're impatient or just vent their frustrations with the world. So we should be alive to that happening.
Yeah, we've found, as you can see with chatbots, how often almost every chatbot has some sort of profanity filter built into it, because we just know the chatbots are going to be abused. And it's interesting how many times after the profanity filter triggers and the chatbot shuts down, the user starts apologizing to the chatbot for having breached the profanity filter, which shows a weird sort of sense of behavior. But as this other question about sort of, does it matter whether you've got a chatbot or a human behind the avatar? We ran some experiments with the Loyola Marymount University in the United States, and within a virtual environment. And we set up a virtual shop with a virtual customer services assistant in there as an avatar. And then we invited people to come into the shop to basically pass comment and look around and do various things. 50% of the time, that shop assistant was being driven by a human. The other 50%, the shop assistant was being driven by a chatbot. 80% of humans who were in there when it was being driven by the chatbot thought it was being driven by a human. And we deliberately didn't tell the human who was driving the virtual shop assistant that they were taking part in the Turing test. So they were behaving totally normally. So it was interesting that given that sort of relatively constrained domain, but still let the person say whatever they wanted to when they were visiting the shop, they couldn't actually tell the difference.
What other uses can we put these types of this technology to, in terms of, say, training, recruitment is huge at the moment, medical rehabilitation? David, we keep going. Yeah,
so we've looked at this idea about using them as virtual life coaches. So you're already seeing sort of apps around there to look at sort of self-help and well-being, and the idea of actually sort of putting a friendly face or using a chatbot as part of that is a fairly obvious step that most of them are already taking. The idea about using them for recruitment, certainly in the United States, I think it was Sergeant Star is what the Department of Defense created, or the US Army created, so as to actually help people through the process of recruiting into the military. So it basically provided you with a confidant and assistant through the training process. We've looked at how we can use them to then support training once people have actually gone into the army, and really thinking about them as part of a flipped classroom model. So actually, let's use the human instructors for the stuff that really needs a human brain power and human insight. And let's use the chatbot or the virtual human to deliver the PowerPoint content, ask the questions around the PowerPoint content, and so that actually when you come into actually having people physically together or synchronously together, then you can really use that as a valuable session. The area that particularly interests us is around corporate knowledge management, and this idea about a virtual persona. And there's sort of two versions of that. The more acceptable version of that is about the idea of creating a project persona, so that when you're working on a project, you actually have a virtual human who is part of that project, who begins to gather in all the knowledge and information of everybody who works on that project. Because project teams typically, they come together, people move, people change, and nobody can remember, Christ, why did we do this? When you're thinking back 3 or 4 years later. Whereas if you had that virtual project persona, you would just ask that persona. The more extreme version, and definitely getting into interesting ethical territory, is the idea of the virtual persona. So again, within a business, within an organization, people change jobs with increasing regularity. So why not, when I leave my job, why isn't there a virtual David Burden there who is ready to answer the questions of my successor about, what did I do with IORMA? What did I think about Ross? How can you use this technology? And it's basically, we describe it as having the past on speed dial. You just dial up a Zoom call with that virtual human to understand what they did. And that's a very different approach to corporate knowledge management.
And are we at that stage yet where we could have that sort of technology?
We are at the stage where we can have it badly. When we did the project, again with MOD, we said at the very beginning, we'll do this, but we'll do it badly, because we don't think the technology is quite there yet. But only by doing it badly do we understand where the issues are and where the problems are. We were quite surprised that in testing, the character was reckoned to be about a 40% representation of the person it was meant to be representing, which we thought was an incredibly high score for what it was doing. And this was 2 years ago, and the technology has moved on quite significantly since then. So I think with it's something we're working on, as a potential product, and it's something that I think is certainly achievable if people want to put in the same sort of money as they're putting into other corporate management projects.
Sounds really interesting and exciting, but also very worrying all at the same time. And
as I say, there are huge ethical issues about who owns that information. So if we have a virtual Julie, can your employer carry on using virtual Julie when you leave? Or can you take virtual Julie with you and clone 3 or 4 copies of her and send her out to go and earn your pension for you? And the most interesting one is basically, what happens if, God forbid, you fall underneath a bus? What happens to that virtual Julie? Does that virtual Julie continue at some form of digital afterlife? And do your next of kin have access to virtual Julie as well? So it's a fascinating raft of it's actually an emerging field called death tech. And there are a number of companies now which are looking at this idea about you creating virtual personas of you to basically live on after your death.
It's like the conversation around that and the regulations around that we're not even there yet.
Which is why we said we ought to start doing the project now, so as to start to surface these issues and at least start to sort of get these discussions going. So there are going to be some huge ethical issues, and if you combine it with discussions around deep fakes and things like that, how do we even know if it's a copy of me? How do we even know I'm still around? You couldn't probably in 5 or 10 years' time.
Is there any other potential uses of this technology, maybe less worrying ones? Jim?
Well, I think we've covered most of the potential, and everybody's alive to where it would be deployed today if we had the options to do so. The telemedicine one's fascinating on so many levels because you could achieve so much in one session. I mean, if we think about diagnosis, even again, one of the vendors we're talking to at the moment, I mean, diagnosis of speech patterns is not new. I mean, it's 50 or so years old. It was first used, so talkativeness or an increased rate of speech, for example, correlates with some, bipolarism, for example. There's a strong correlation between those speeches and voice. I think it was 50 or so years ago. It was first raised as a way of diagnosing these illnesses. So, if you can be doing many things in one sitting, or as David said earlier, if you can get to the details sooner, then that's got to be hugely valuable for all involved. And then, if you look at the empathic project we've been involved in, we're as much a life coach for solitary elderly individuals, right, who have very little engagement with people in their life. So to bring some value back, but also to make sure that they're adhering to those protocols that will sustain their life. Have you taken your medicine? Have you done everything you needed to do today? Did you do your exercises that you were told to do by your physio? All of these things, very simple, but to have that constant overwatch of these things that are in the best interests of the patient or the person in charge of it. And it should be seen, I hope, as the person in charge of that digital interaction. But there's a lot more value to be explored. I think, as David said, we're really at the tip of the iceberg on this stuff. Yeah,
definitely sounds like it. Moving on to slightly different topics. So when we look at virtual and augmented reality, how do we use those technologies to increase the intelligence and the humanization of virtual humans, like what we've been discussing for the last 20 minutes or so? Ross?
Yes. With the virtual reality side of things, as I mentioned earlier, you're actually working at a lower resolution simply because you're covering 360 degrees. So the actual sort of the actual look of it is actually less realistic than you would get on screen or in interacting that way. But what you gain from being immersed and having your peripheral vision encased in a VR space is massive. I think is a massive sort of a emotional change. And I think when I started having meetings in VR, it really was different. I was really taken aback by even though our avatars at that time really weren't realistic at all, they were kind of ridiculous. But there's a really strong connection because the person you're speaking to, you could see how their body was moving or interacting with you. And there was something about that which actually made it a lot easier to communicate. And I think there was a paper which was done recently at Stanford from Jeremy I've forgotten his name, sorry, but he was doing one about sort of like Zoom fatigue on sort of how tiring it gets by looking onto a few monitors and such like, and the type of effect it has, and how tired it makes you. And they're kind of referring to the size of people's faces on Zoom and things are so different and things. There's so many different ways your brain's having to work things out that it's a way of being a lot more tiring. Whereas in VR, everything is a similar scale as we're used to in real life when we're meeting people. So I think there's so many sort of benefits of that in meeting and being able to communicate with people in VR, and especially, as I was saying, for companionship and that as well. I think that's yeah, that's just to be touched. And also, as keep quoting David, but it's you know, we can do a lot of things really badly at the moment, but it's all about signs going into the future and just reading and working out what we can do. We're working on VR project in educational space at the moment, and also one for mental health. And earlier this week, we're talking about one about onboarding for a company, how we can incorporate that as well. So I think with VR, there's a lot of potential out there.
Yeah, I wouldn't be so worried about the resolution question in VR, because in VR, we're basically all avatars. And so whatever the platform is, that sets the standard for what humans, you know, what a person looks like. And so the virtual human is able to pick up the same avatar effectively as a physical human. So I think in VR, it's not an issue. I think potentially where it is more interesting is around in the augmented reality space. So with the augmented reality space, what we should be able to do is, you know, going back to the healthcare situation, you know, if you want a talk with the virtual nurse, then the virtual nurse should be able to appear on your sofa or in the armchair across from you. And in those situations, we're probably more likely to want those higher resolution avatars, because we'd expect the avatar to then just blend into the reality that we're dealing with. I mean, the other thing, again, picking up on something Ross was saying, was about that different sense when you're in virtual realities. Things like social distance actually becomes incredibly important in times of the virtual environment. So actually what you begin to have to do is you need to get the virtual human to understand things like social distancing. And that's one of the things we discovered quite early on, is we wrote the routine so when somebody arrives in a virtual house, the virtual avatar walks up to them. But of course, initially you just say, well, go to X where the person is. And basically the two of them smack into each other. So instead, actually, you have to tell the avatar, no, go up to a social distance away from that person. And as that other person moves, again, you maintain a social distance. So there are all sorts of interesting things we have to think about once we go into a virtual space.
And you probably have to think about the cultural differences as well, you know, in terms of, you know, some cultures are very demonstrative, touchy-feely, we should say, and others are very more formal. So this is something we could consider in terms of how these characters interact with one another.
Yes, I mean, so making them socially aware, which is that much easier, certainly on things like the web, because you get at least a chance of understanding where it is the other person's coming from. In your virtual world, the person you're talking to could be from absolutely anywhere. And so trying to understand what sort of cultural expectations that person has and trying to identify those early on is very hard.
Ross, coming back to what you were saying about virtual reality, and when we think about, say, the visualization of how the character looks and the intelligence of how the character behaves, which one is the limiting factor here? You know, is one technology holding back the other, or?
Yeah, I mean, physical is, yeah, getting the images to look more human, having that enough data going through that to make it look human at the moment is what's holding it back. But as David says, it's amazing how once you're in VR, that really isn't so much of an issue. But it will be very interesting to see that once we do get sort of realistic humans working and interacting together in VR, how much difference that feels as well. I think if you put anything haptic into VR, that's your immersive sense is just sort of multiplied. We've been doing some projects recently where we're working with physical features in the real world. So we're lining them up to like walls and things in VR as in real life. And even if you just lean against a wall, the extra sense of immersion is quite surprising, even it's just a simple thing as that. And you're also looking at the different things about heat control as well being brought into sort of VR, and different sensors, and you're getting hand gloves and stuff like this. So these are all kind of add-ons to it. So they all eventually, once everything gets up to a certain level, will be quite a big step forward, but they're all sort of kind of gradual little steps at the moment. and just heading there. And what James is working on is really interesting. I think the voice and bringing some more AI and interactivity is going to be the real breakthrough. I think that's going to be really fascinating in VR.
Actually really leads into my next question perfectly. So Jim, if we take it back to the consumer, the third part of this discussion. So currently, consumers are faced by phone, online chat interactions. But when many are used in like a triage situation to sort out kind of very simple queries, but there seems to be a problem when it comes to more complex queries. How are these types of technologies we're discussing today, how can they help this problem, or solve this problem, say escalating the query to the right person, to a decision maker?
There's a lot of learning to be done yet, and we're seeing conversational analytics are becoming, dare I say it, mainstream. So that allows an organization for the first time really to perform that deep dive on what excellence looks like within their organization. And only once they've done that, I think, can you take that data and augment it with the technologies that David and Ross are talking about. We're very much at the data gathering end of this particular problem. But, if you think about triage, if we understand what most of our problems look like, and if you think, a great example of where this goes wrong is Expedia. Okay, so, this is some time ago now, but, it's an online platform. They found that 56% or so of all of their customers were making contact with their contact center, and it was as simple as failing when they finally got into the detail of what turned out to be $100 million a year problem. It was simply that people didn't understand how to print out their itinerary. So unless you debriefed everybody in that contact center, until you debriefed everybody, they didn't understand what the problem was, but they were losing $100 million a year to this problem. But with our technology, you can understand at the most simplest end of things, you can understand themes and trends across your contact center. You can understand from simple inputs such as the CRM, the value of that engagement, the sales enablement piece. We can say, okay, we'll plot some simple metrics. And we can say this agent's our best agent at selling this particular line of product, or they're the best at de-escalating these problems in a complaints environment. What are the features and traits of this individual, and how do they align to our brand? And those are the things you might want to take forward and use as the underpinnings for your digital human in terms of those interactions. So you can put your very best foot forward. And, Julie, I talk about it all the time, is from our perspective, in terms of fraud investigation, it's about having your best investigator, because they've been there, seen it and done it, because they've augmented all of that learning from every single agent over, however long your call recordings go back, to come up with some really powerful metrics that we can use in terms of identifying fraud when we apply that feature extraction over the top. So yeah, you can learn and you can put your best foot forward. You can also then understand at which point the system cannot deal with this problem and it needs escalation to a human. But we can help there with a hot handover, so we understand what's being discussed. Simple things again, like named entity recognition. We can pull out the topics and themes from the digital world and put them in front of the human in the loop. And the human in the loop is really important to us today in terms of decision making. We're not at a stage yet where we can have automated decision making within a financial services environment, for example. That human's really important. So getting the most value from that human in the shortest amount of time is where the technology comes to bear. But of course, at the back end, we need to protect that human in the loop, because, again, back to the dark arts of fraud, but the fraudster will always try and find vulnerabilities in the system and push past it. And we know that happens with IVR, with account takeover. Typically the fraudster will attack the IVR 30 or so times to try and elicit those personal details that when they go to the human in the loop, they sound convincing. I am Jim Laird. My first dog was called such and such, and I went to school here. Because you've managed to get those details. And then if you start bullying and dominating the agent, you might try and push through to the next phase, or manipulate with background noise such as crying babies, whatever it might be. So by understanding all of these tricks, because we've seen it, we've been there, we've done it, we can put another barrier up, so we can protect both the genuine customer and the organization now, and remove that stress from the human, because it is highly stressful to make these decisions or to be confronted with that kind of behavior. I hope that answers your question, but effectively, for us, it's about, at the moment, let's build out as smart a system as we can by understanding how good we've been. It's not about doing something in a different way. It's about doing it consistently well.
And your work with Intelligent Voice is looking at using these sorts of technologies to assess veracity of what people are saying.
It is.
Go on, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so that's our particular niche, if you like, and we see applicability for that technology in many different environments. You know yourself, you know, we were funded by UKRI to build out a solution to a problem that is yet to be resolved, sort of first party fraud. So otherwise genuine customers misleading the organisation. And, you know, we've applied our understanding of behavioural science to bring out features that are specific to deception. And we look at a principle of expected versus unexpected. And that's where this augmented piece comes to bear again, with that human in the loop. So if we ask a particular question, and that could be an open question, a closed question, we can tell the system what it relates to in the process. And we know from how we've interacted with other customers with ground truth to say whether that was a fraudulent interaction or a genuine customer. We can say what expected versus unexpected looks like in that engagement. And that way we can flag it. And the agent then is empowered to concentrate on what they're really there for, which is that kind of John Lewis customer-centric approach to that contact center piece. The system sits in the background helping with that decision-making process. Genuine customers are dealt with more quickly. And, you know, one of the biggest learnings from us is from this project over the last 2 years has been about identifying the tight correlation between customer behavior and agent behavior. And I spoke about account takeover. So with a sort of rules-based system, if somebody's being rude and bullying, that is a social engineering tactic. But perhaps I am a genuine customer, and perhaps this is the 10th time I've called you, and you're really failing me. So I could make that an awful lot worse by escalating you on a rules-based system into our special investigation unit as a potential fraudster, or I could pull out all the stops now and recognise that actually the failing's on my side, not your side, and I need to do the best for you in that particular engagement. So the technology itself, really exciting in terms of performance and false positive reduction, which means that for that genuine customer, that claim cycle is reduced, we can deal with them more efficiently and with greater confidence. And that, you know, focus on financial services, but of course, again, I can't keep coming back to telemedicine today, but, you know, understanding that I'm getting full disclosure helps me to help you, because I can get to the details more quickly. And yes, it might be an uncomfortable conversation, but it's one that needs to be had. So let me help you. And again, how much do I need to help you is one particular problem, you know, huge problem in the US in terms of opioid abuse. So do you genuinely need these drugs? Are you in real pain? Is this a real problem for you now? Crosses over into our work in insurance with whiplash, etc. Is this a genuine individual, genuinely representing pain, discomfort, and the symptoms that would lead to a significant financial reward for them if they sought to hoodwink us on this particular occasion?
Thank you, Jim. Very interesting, very comprehensive. For the last 10 minutes, I'm going to go through the Q&A. I'm just going to put them out there. Okay, we have a question from John Andrews. What do the panel think will be the likely impact of digital humans, chatbots, artificial intelligence on human employment over the next few years, say to 2030? And he's given an example, say for a specific example, will be contact centers. Who wants to go for this one? Ross.
Yeah. Well, probably coming more from the film side, probably more than the contact center side. But yeah, you can see sort of, I think it's very similar to how AI is at the moment as well. You know, you can see it coming. I mean, I started life in photography and we're doing hand printing and such like, and you saw what happened when digital finally came in. There were a few false dawns, but when it did come in, it came in really fast. You know, so when it did change over, you know, to digital cameras and then phone cameras and things like that, it's it you know, really escalated so quickly. And I think in the film industry, if you're looking at sort of extras and digital doubles and things like this, I think it's not going to happen overnight. There's going to be sort of a big change, and also with virtual sets and things. I think Mandalorian was done on Unreal with virtual sets with LEDs and things like this, and so you're changing. The process is changing, so I think you're getting a lot of even the crew and things like this, in sort of film crews and grips and lighting technicians and things like this. It's going to be a big change in the end, because what VFX and digitization does, it gives the choice for directors and films to make decisions later and later in the day when you can change things. So it all backs up to post-production where they can change almost any element. And then you can get something like volumetric filming as well, which means you can make choices even more later on. So I see, yeah, sort of big potential, of the film industry being, changed.
Yeah, there's an interesting graphic that shows the shifting employment patterns in the United States over about the last 30, 40 years. And it starts off in the 1950s with farmers, secretaries and typists, I think, as being the top 3 employees or top 3 roles. And then to the present day, it's truck drivers, teachers and call center operators or customer service operators. And, all the indications are that all those truck drivers are going to be replaced by autonomous vehicles over the next sort of couple of decades. And I think, all the people in the contact center jobs will be as well. And as one of the questions says later on, actually, most human staff appear to be reading from a script. Well, if they're reading from a script, why on earth bother to have the human? Let's just have the computer do it. And it's about the jobs where there is a higher degree of uncertainty and chaos. They are going to be the good ones for the humans, which is why teaching, I think, will still continue very much to be a significantly sort of human role, albeit supported by the virtual human side. The challenge in the contact center side of it is to move both the human and the computer away from that scripted approach, and trying to give them, certainly on the computer side, a broader understanding, a lot more common sense. I mean, that's often where computers fail, is they just don't have common sense. But actually putting a common sense into a virtual human is a very challenging task to do.
What you mentioned was similar to what you were saying, Jim, about, the contact centers, keeping the human contact center agent for the correct role, rather than just, reading from a script.
Yeah, I'd agree. And, let's not pretend that AI is going to be the reason for humans being moved out of the contact center. I mean, offshoring, etc. Contact centers have, the drive to cut costs is not something new within that environment. But it has to be, as you say, Julie, that you're directing these calls to the right person in the right place at the right time. And that's where that augmented piece has value. Let's make sure that our expert for your particular problem is always available, so that we can deal with this first time. And, it's that failure demand piece. If we can knock that out, that's where the cost saving can be felt too. And across the whole customer life cycle, because if you've dealt with my problem quickly and efficiently, then that can only be of benefit when it comes to retention, renewal, whatever it might be. It's going to be about, as David says, people's roles will shift over time. It's just the natural evolution of things.
Okay, good. We have a question from Tracy Constance. Hi, Tracy. Synthesized speech is beginning to sound more like humans. And if we arrive at a stage where the human ear, if we arrive at a stage where the human ear can't actually tell the difference, is this going to be dangerous for society, as it can be used to impersonate humans? And I think, Ross, you mentioned, deep fakes near the beginning. Where are we with that? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think it is, and I think as James is mentioning before, is that scammers will always find ways of scamming, and any new technology kind of opens up the door. Anything which is fairly powerful will open up the door for misuse. So yeah, everyone's just got to be on the ball, I guess, for how it can be misused in such ways.
Sorry, David, after you.
Yeah, I was saying, one of the things that we find is interesting around synthesized speech is that there appears to be sort of less progress on that than there is about the visual look of the avatar. Because typically, if we want to go out and give a voice to a virtual human, we've only got probably a dozen English voices to choose between, probably not even that, and most of them are very posh. and you're trying to create a persona for a bot, and then you find you can get the bot looking exactly as you want, but you can't find the voice to match it, and that really sort of breaks the consumer trust side of things. What is interesting is that there's a lot of work on in the medical area going on to the idea about creating voice fonts. So where people are going to be losing their voice due to surgery, they can actually bank recordings of their voice, which can then be used to artificially generate it afterwards. And that technology is moving on fairly fast, and that will actually hopefully open up the range of different accents that we can get for synthesized speech. So whilst actually the visual deepfake now is very easy to do, or relatively easy to do, trying to do the same on the audio side is actually a lot harder.
I think with an eye on that being something in the not too distant future, I mean, I saw it the other day, LinkedIn, for example, now allows you to leave a voice recording of how you wish your name to be pronounced. And I had a conversation with the fraud analyst at Gartner about this. I mean, as this technology evolves, I think we need to start being smarter about how we represent ourselves online now, because what we don't want is for that audio sample to be misused in the future. I mean, the first we'll hear about it is when it's used inappropriately, and then it will be too late. So, you know, there's some safeguards and some, to use some common sense. As David says, it's difficult enough to get into virtual humans, but it's difficult enough to get into genuine humans. Let's think about what we put out there now, because if we don't, it could well be yet another problem to solve, but we don't need to if we do the right things now.
Okay. Quick one. Where does the UK rate for research and development of virtual humans, and which country is in the lead? Any ideas?
Oh, I think that's very hard to judge. You know, we obviously tend to see a lot more coming out of the States just because of the sheer amount of money that's being piled into it. You look at the VC funding that's going to some of these areas in the States, and it appears to outstrip, you know, massively what we're doing in the UK and the rest of Europe. That said, you know, there are individual areas of expertise in different universities and with different startups across Europe. But I think, as ever, you know, the one to watch is China, and particularly because there tends to be a very different attitude to some of these technologies in the whole of the Far East, and actually they're a lot more open to them. You know, if you go on to a virtual environment like VARC, which is all about virtual avatars dancing for you. You know, that's a very acceptable sort of mode of entertainment, effectively, in East Asia. And so I think it'll be what's happening in China, what's happening in Japan, South Korea will be the ones to watch.
A question from my colleague Nadeem Kazi. What is the importance of research on virtual humans? So are we still completely in research, or are we moving more into, you know, this technology is at a point where we can just develop it?
We're in different, we actually did a heat map where we decomposed what a virtual human consists of, and then a heat map of where we think the research is. And there are some areas which are very heavily researched, like the visual representation, natural language understanding to a certain extent. Far less research is things like natural language generation, or motivation, or how we sort of manage and look at memory. So it's, you know, it's a curate's egg in terms of where the research is. What's interesting though, increasingly a lot of the research isn't necessarily technical research. It's more psychological research, and trying to understand actually how humans do this and how the human-machine interaction works. So I think there's an awful lot of employment for psychologists going forwards.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question to you all. A quick one, because we've got about 1 minute. What developments do you see coming forward in the months and years ahead? What's the big thing that's going to be exciting and interesting?
For me, I think it's the empathic reading. So letting the virtual human read the non-visual, the non-verbal cues of the interaction will be a key area.
Thank you. Ross?
Yeah, I think, well, from a personal point of view, it's the improvement in rendering from our point of view, as I think that opens up the door for us to do quite a few new things.
Okay, and Jim?
I think in the near term, it's the inferencing, better inferencing in terms of better decision making, in terms of understanding what is it you want from in this interaction, and what am I presenting in response to how I'm presenting my need.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to wrap up what has been an extremely stimulating discussion and to offer a big thank you to all our panel members for their participation. Some housekeeping now. Can audience members please remember to complete the post-webinar questionnaire, which should appear automatically when you sign off. The date of the next IORMA Insight is Thursday, the 25th of March. The topic is green energy with panel members Simon Main from OVO Energy, Greg Swenson, Briggs McAdam, and Richard Jackson from UCL. And you can find details about this on the IORMA website. And finally, there will be a recording of this afternoon's webinar available on the IORMA website in the next 48 hours. Good luck, everybody, and thank you all for your participation, especially to our esteemed panel members. Thank you.